I'm CNN tech reporter Claire Duffy.
Claire Duffy
is here with us.
I cover artificial intelligence and other new technologies for a living. And even I sometimes get overwhelmed trying to keep up with it all and stay safe in the process. On the podcast, Terms of Service, we can explore how to experiment with these new tools without getting played by them. Listen to CNN's Terms of Service wherever you get your podcasts.
Funding for the Think podcast comes from Wise, an app for people using money around the globe. With the Wise account, you can send, spend, and receive in up to 40 currencies. You can download the Wise app or learn more at wise.com. Terms and conditions apply.
If you happen to be super sexy or super wealthy, evolutionary psychology suggests you will have your pick of lovers and live happily ever after. But if that's true, why are there so many spectacular breakups in Hollywood and Silicon Valley? And if everyone's mate preferences are hardwired by evolution, how is it even possible to find real happiness with someone who will never be a supermodel or a tech titan? From KERA in Dallas, this is Think. I'm Chris Boyd. It may indeed be close to impossible to find and woo the perfect partner. But a partner who is perfect for us or close enough to do the job, that search is worth our time because it's much more likely to end well. Paul Eastwick has studied this. He is professor of psychology at the University of California, Davis, where he serves as head of the Social Personality Psychology program and director of the Attraction and Relationships Research Laboratory. His new book is called Bonded by Evolution, the New Science of Love and Connection. Paul, welcome to Think.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Before we talk about your sense that evolutionary biology has led to a somewhat distorted understanding of how and why we form romantic relationships, maybe you can start by reminding us of the stereotypical interpretation, this thing you have come to call the Evo script.
Yeah, I think the Evo script has a few components that started in the science in the 90s, but it's taken on a whole new life online. And that includes things like everybody has a mate value, a certain set of traits and attributes that make them either desirable or not in the mating game. Another idea is that men and women are these very different creatures who want very different things out of romantic relationships. And a third idea is that, some people are like good for a fling and some people are good for a long-term relationship, but you kind of got to specialize in one or the other. Now, I won't get into all the nefarious ways that these concepts have gotten interpreted online in recent years, but suffice to say, the science behind these ideas has been shown to be weaker than we've thought in the last, 10 to 15 years or so.
I do want to note that the classic version of the Evo script seems to assume heterosexual relationships. Does it offer any insight into how and why relationships form and last or break up among queer couples?
To an extent. I mean, there's been a lot of evolutionary theorizing about same-gender couples, queer couples, in the sense that, it's an important thing to be able to explain why people would have preferences for one gender versus another. And oftentimes those explanations, they kind of have ended up in a different category than the typical way that these things get spun out online when it comes to, the nasty ways that men and women can view each other. There are lots of things in the broader science of sex and sexuality and attraction that absolutely informs a close relationships perspective. And some of those things have important evolutionary angles too. So I'm sure that we'll end up touching on some of those components today.
There are three main pillars of the classic Evo script. You already mentioned inherent mate value. This is what the relative attractiveness of a person compared to all the other people?
Yeah, I mean, it's this idea that we kind of sort people on a scale, right, from 1 to 10. And there are people that we would say, oh, this person's an 8 or this person's a 3. And we have a colloquial understanding of what that means. But scientifically, what folks have often tried to do is say, okay, well, what are the desirable attributes that these people have? Maybe, some people are especially attractive, some people are very confident, some people are very intelligent. And it is often assumed that the way people go about forming and maintaining relationships has to do with how those values set you up to succeed or fail on what's often euphemistically called a mating market, as if you're trying to trade off your value to get the best possible other partner.
What does the Evo script suggest about what men and women are programmed by evolution to prioritize in relationships? Like, what are we supposed to want?
Yeah, so there you see a lot of ideas about gender differences in the traits that men and women find desirable. So if you ask men and women, you'll see that women will say they care about things like earning potential and ambition more than men do, and men will say that they care about things like physical attractiveness more than women do. You'll find those kinds of gender differences really routinely throughout the world. And this is something that's been studied for a long time. I would just add the caveat or the note that realize that we're talking about what people say they're looking for. This is what people rate when you give them scales and things like that.
So, broadly speaking, it really only takes a few minutes to make a baby, but it takes a long time to make a life together. What does that Evo script assume about the utility of long-term relationships?
This is a good question. So, in classic evolutionary theorizing, what often happens is that it's thought that men and women have it's almost like they have different modes of mating. Sometimes it's called strategies, and that many times a long-term strategy would be used. So people would choose to invest in a long-term partner and invest in the offspring that come out of those relationships. And then there would be other occasions where people would be interested in especially short-term relationships. So, classic evolutionary theorizing does indeed acknowledge that there are long-term contexts that especially men might want to invest in. But importantly, it always places an emphasis on the fact that when it comes to some sort of short-term versus long-term distinction, men are going to fall somewhere closer to the short-term end, and women are going to fall closer to the long-term end. And this is kind of how men and women end up being arranged on that short-term, long-term dimension, if that makes any sense.
So talk about what you discovered about how casual sex plays into these perceptions and what realities those studies might overlook.
Yeah, so casual sex, when it comes to gender differences, casual sex is maybe the one that you can find the most reliably. And this is that when you ask men and women, men will say that they're more interested in casual sex than women are. I think it's useful to point out a few things about the way that this gender difference emerges across different contexts. So famously, there's a study in our field where researchers go around and ask, random people on college campuses things like, "I've noticed you around and I find you very attractive. Would you go to bed with me?" Okay. When you ask men and women these questions, well, what happens is that the men are often fairly enthusiastic, and the women very rarely say yes to this request. In fact, quite often they're terrified by what's going on. Now, often this experiment is used as an illustration of that gender difference. But I want to point out an important hidden assumption here, which is that these people are being approached by strangers. And so if you assume that casual sex is happening in the context of meeting strangers, yes, that gender difference is very, very large. That gender difference is not as dramatic if we now sort of ramp up the acquaintance between people. So among folks who have known each other a little bit, you'll still find a sex difference in the desire for casual sex, but it's not nearly as dramatic as what you see when you're being approached by strangers. Look in long-term close relationships now. So now we're not talking about casual sex. We're just talking about who wants to have sex with their partners on a given day. And there's a sex difference, but it's pretty small. And I think this all says something very important about the way we think about sex, that maybe the large gender differences, it's not about sex or interest in sex per se. It's about the context in which it's happening, and honestly, the extent to which people are being propositioned by scary strangers, which is a little bit unique in a modern context.
And being down for casual sex at any given moment is, generally speaking, less risky in a lot of ways for men than it might be for women.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And look, you'll find in other kinds of studies too. Um, if you ask bisexual men, like but bisexual women get it because if you ask them, you sort of put them through these same kinds of studies. The bisexual women, even if they're being approached by a stranger, way more interested in having sex with a woman than with a man, right? So a lot of this effect is found, it's not about who's being approached, it's about who's doing the approaching. And there is something very intimidating about a strange man coming up to you. I just want to note, in the largest studies that look at these things, it's like 2% of women will say yes to have sex with a stranger. But when women think back on real times in their lives when this has happened, which is much more likely to be somebody they know, that number goes up to 40%. It's still less than men, but I focus on that difference. Like there is something with the stranger context that is really freaking people out.
And before we move on from this, a man who is, at a bar or a party and sees a woman he's attracted to and thinks, yes, I would like to have casual sex with this woman, that doesn't mean that he is not potentially open to a longer term relationship with that person if they really click.
Yeah, I mean, this has been the thing that has really, at least for me, called into question this simple binary between somebody is good for a short term or a long term relationship, or you're good at one or the other. And it's that when people are initiating things, sexual things, relational things, they often have no idea where it's going. And that the uncertainty is really part of the name of the game. So we find, for example, there's no difference in how far a relationship is likely to progress depending on where you meet this person. So just because this guy is meeting this stranger in a club and like thinks she's hot and wants to hook up with her, let's say that ends up going somewhere, it's not like that relationship is more or less likely to succeed than if he'd met her, I don't know, at some calmer location like church or something. And so I think this goes to this idea that in many ways, the key thing is like meeting people and seeing if there's a connection rather than trying to suss out like, oh, like you're the kind of person that's good for a quickie or the kind of person that's good for a long-term relationship. That's usually not the way people go about this.
So this gets us to the core of your argument here, which is that humans form mating bonds when they have sexual and romantic compatibility. Explain compatibility to us.
Yeah. Yeah. So if we go back to the mate value idea, this idea that some people are very popular and some people are very not. Okay. That's one way of explaining, who's going to be attracted to whom. But what's often going on whenever we look at how one person feels about another person, very little of it in the long run has to do with that person's core popularity or their core desirability as it would be viewed by other people. What ends up playing an enormous role is what I call compatibility, which I'm using to refer to the extent to which I am interested in you above and beyond how popular you are and above and beyond like, how much I just generally tend to like people. It's like you do something uniquely for me. And this becomes an essential part of explaining attraction, especially as people get to know each other over time. So here's what this ends up meaning if we put it back in that mate value context. Okay, let's say everybody agrees on average this person is a 6. They're middlingly desirable. But I might happen to think that she's a 9, okay? And that's what I mean by compatibility. It's about finding, well, where do I think this person maybe has more going for them than other people do? And this is often the thing that helps relationships to progress.
Paul, generally speaking, you note that the vast proportion of our evolution as a species took place when we lived in small groups. Why is that significant for properly understanding how humans actually ended up as partners, romantic partners for most of our history?
Yeah, so I think it's tempting to think that there's some that there's some evolutionary parallel to what we see today, where, we meet all of these strangers, and if you're on the apps and dating, this sense that there's a limitless amount of choice. But that was not what people faced in recent history, and especially as we were evolving 100,000, half a million, or even 2 million years ago. Because to the best that we can ascertain, when humans were evolving, we evolved in these small groups, maybe 50 people or so, who were hunting and gathering and moving from place to place. Now, you might get to meet a few other nearby groups. They might also have 50 people or so. But still, if you do the math, what you realize is that your total pool of possible romantic partners, the people that were your preferred gender and the people that were roughly your age and who weren't partnered already, you're talking about a rather small pool, not the deluge of choice that we think we have today. Now, maybe that lack of choice sounds like, well, that'd be terrible. I would not want to live in that environment. But let me also point out, on the flip side, what you have going for you is the fact that you're going to likely get to know these people over a somewhat extended period of time. What that means is that not everybody has to make a dynamite first impression to find a partner in an ancestral context. What people have to do is figure out, well, who grows on me over time. And in many ways, that would have been the key process that would have mattered in our, deep evolutionary past.
I was thinking about this in the context of the miniseries that's out now about John F. Kennedy Jr. and Carolyn Bessette. And it makes you think that
Yeah.
compatibility is a factor because, before Carolyn Bessette, he was dating Daryl Hannah, who was every bit as beautiful. He is successful. Presumably, they had equivalent mating value. If you believe the evolutionary script, it seems as if they should have stayed together forever. But for whatever reason, and I haven't seen the series, but there was something that tore them apart.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is very, very key to understand. It's like it seems obvious to us when we're perceiving other people. Like that person's a nine. That's some objective truth about what they are like. But we really miss all of that variability, like the example that I gave earlier. And it goes in the other direction too. So we might be looking at somebody and it looks like they've landed this amazing partner. How wonderful that they've landed a 10. But what you don't see are the challenges that they're experiencing in that relationship. Or you don't see that, like, hey, actually, they have a dimmer view of that person than what their overall value would suggest. I think in many ways, these kinds of motivated reasoning processes or these individual differences in how we think about potential partners, this can be useful for building strong relationships. That's usually the context in which I think about this. Because if two people are quote unquote sixes, but they think that each other is a nine or a 10, well, then it's going to be pretty difficult for an eight or a nine to come along and break them up because they already think they won the lottery. And often, like, that's the sign that you want to see in relationships. Sometimes we call them positive illusions. It just refers to the fact that I think my partner is amazing, and I'm so sorry the rest of you don't agree, but
Mm.
I feel pretty lucky out here.
How did the idea of dating and mating as markets take hold and take such a firm sort of grip on how we all perceive the process?
It's a very good question. And I can think of like two related explanations. One is that this is a useful way, I think, of understanding what happens with like marriage patterns in the aggregate. So, like when the sociologists were studying marriage, like, in the 20th century and before that, even, you can do all sorts of interesting studies looking at the economics of marriage and who marries whom and, what that does to the social structure in general. That's all absolutely fascinating and is really based in this premise that, hey, if people aren't meeting each other, they are not going to marry each other. And this was often a way that the wealthy held on to their wealth by making sure that their kids, didn't meet the riffraff. But there's another component too, because I think we started really applying these ideas to attraction contexts as well. I think there's something to be said for an idea that when people are meeting at first, that can feel like a market because all we have to go on when we're first meeting, not all we have to go on, much of what we have to go on is each other's mate value. Um, but it's also important to realize that, relationships can sometimes take a while to form. And classically, when people were meeting each other, they were meeting each other over extended periods of time. It wasn't a first impression and then you're done. So I think the combination of, living in a world with more snap judgments, 20-minute coffee dates, and online dating, that really reinforces the market metaphor and kind of took that old sociological work, which I think is very good, in this other direction, and I just think it's gotten a little bit overblown.
Online dating is so interesting because it's a little bit like online shopping for a partner.
Yeah.
And it also implies you can return the one you didn't like very much and find another one at any moment.
Yeah, yeah, and this has all sorts of nefarious effects because it means that when we're online dating, we're going in and we're trying to evaluate. Okay. We're trying to figure out, okay, are you good enough? And we are very willing to trust our snap judgments about another person. And if you don't wow me over coffee, then I'm probably going to bail. Um, Look, this works for some people. So some people make very good first impressions and can keep that ball rolling, and that's great for them. But there are many people who don't come across as initially especially desirable and yet can still be a very good partner for somebody. But it requires an opportunity for people to get to know each other. And so I lament the loss of these ways of experiencing and getting to know other people that, I mean, for lack of a better term, force people to keep interacting, whether they choose to or not. I'm thinking about, things like classrooms or any of the many third spaces that people used to go to. I encourage people to sign up for an intramural sports league or an improv class or something along those lines, not just because it'll take like three impressions for you to really hit it off with somebody, but just because the simple act of spending time with people and growing your social networks, in many ways, like that's the lost art to finding a partner. And I think it could be helpful for more people to get back into that.
Why do lab studies of human sexual attractiveness yield one set of results that might not actually map perfectly onto real world encounters among people who are seeking romantic relationships?
Yeah, this is really key, and this was one of the first findings that we came across that changed our view on this. As I mentioned earlier, we would find all the time that in these simple laboratory studies, you'd ask men and women about their preferences for different attributes, and you'd get very different answers. But what we started seeing when we were looking at first impression context, we were looking at speed dating, for example. Now, speed dating is short, I grant that, but at least you're live and face to face across from another person. And all it took was a few minutes of interacting for us to see that actually attractiveness seems to be inspiring people's romantic interest the same, regardless of whether they're men or women. And earning potential seems to be inspiring romantic interest the same, regardless of whether we're looking at men or women. And so this was really our first clue that there was a major disconnect between what people were thinking they liked in the abstract or what they liked on paper and what ultimately appealed to them when they meet somebody face to face. I think it's very easy when we're drawing up what a perfect partner would look like for us on paper to get locked into, a few must-haves, maybe some stereotypes about what the other gender is like, and we kind of miss what it feels like to actually be interacting with a real person, and the way that their traits can sometimes surprise us, either in good ways or in bad ways. So this is why, I'm usually especially interested in, okay, I want to know how you feel about somebody once you've actually met them. And I especially want to know how you feel about them once you've met them on multiple occasions, because often you get the best indicator of how you feel about somebody once you're like a few dates in.
Do people, broadly speaking, end up with partners that they judge to be about as attractive as they are?
Yes, you do see on average an association between, like, if you look at couple members, you'll see associations between their levels of attractiveness. You see couple level similarity on a lot of things, right? I mean, you see it on income and socioeconomic status and values and all of these other components of what a person is like too. Many of those elements really boil down to who's meeting whom in the first place, like I mentioned earlier. And we can use markets to explain that. When it comes to attractiveness, I think this derives from a slightly different process, and it's a competitive process that happens often when people are first meeting. So when relationships form fairly quickly, you indeed see that, like, oh, the attractive people get together with the other attractive people. What is also interesting, though, is that if we look over time, the extent to which two people are matched up, because it's not always going to be the case that eights get with eights, and you also see, eights get with fives. Is that a bad sign? Is that a warning sign if an eight got together with a five? It's not a problem at all. The level of mismatch doesn't predict anything down the road. And that has to do with what I was talking about earlier, because we have these motivated perceptions, yeah, okay, everybody else thinks I'm a five, but you think I'm a nine. And the fact that you think I'm a nine, that's the most important thing. That's what's going to predict the longevity of the relationship, not whether we're, exactly matched or not.
Yeah, in the book, you acknowledge that maybe only a small fraction of us get to date partners that everyone considers a 10, but lots of us get to date partners we think are a 10.
Yeah, I mean, I just think this is the central thing. If we want to understand, like, the nature of human relationships, and it's not that, not everybody feels like they won the lottery. I really do recognize that. But there is so much room for construction of one's relationship, for, like, finding the things that you and your partner, or you and somebody that you're trying to build something with, and you're not quite sure what the romantic potential is or not, but you're trying to figure out, like, is there something here that we can build around? And once you get to that point where you're kind of constructing something together, this, like, what does everybody else think of you? It just all kind of starts to fade. And what ends up mattering a lot more is how we interact when we're together, the patterns we form, like our goofy in jokes, and also, like, the rituals we build. And sometimes these things can end up going badly. I mean, I think this is why a lot of relationships run into trouble too. But in many cases, this is what helps people to sustain that sense that, how lucky am I? I got to be with somebody that I think is a 10, and she thinks I'm a 10 too.
As you say, Paul, one key to lasting compatibility is this building of a shared narrative about who two people are as a couple. What does that look like?
Yeah, we think about it, it's like a little culture that two people are creating. And, a culture really is, a shared set of customs, rituals, the goofy things that we do together, the in-jokes that we share. And, I think what often makes relationships feel irreplaceable are these components. And the fact that, like, we have a history together, like, that history ends up feeling like an essential part of who we are. It's almost like we incorporate that history into our identity. So, when we see in the studies too, that when people feel like, not that they've just, spent time with their partner that day, but with their partner, they have engaged in these special rituals that are really all their own. We ask couples to explain these things to us. We have no idea what they're talking about, right? I mean, they have goofy names like, tunnel time on Wacker Drive. This is in Chicago. I think I know what that means. Maybe they're driving along Lower Wacker. I don't know why they're doing that. But you know what? It's not for me. It's not supposed to be understood by me. It's for them. And when they do this, they end up feeling closer to each other. I think a lot of couples have weird things like this that they do, and it's a very important part of understanding how we sustain relationships ultimately.
It also explains why when people go through a breakup or they have a partner die and they think about dating again, sometimes it feels daunting and exhausting because so much has gone into building those previous relationships.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, breakups are hard because many times we form very strong attachments to our partners. They're the people that we go to for support when we're feeling down, the people that we hope to celebrate our successes. And so when a relationship breaks up, it's like, well, this is a major event for which I would like some support. And the person that I would typically have gone to for that support is now no longer there. So it's like the pain of a breakup hits twice as hard for those reasons. And because we spend so much time building a history with somebody, building an identity with somebody else, when you break up, a lot of times people are genuinely confused about like who they are, what their identity really is. I mean, I've gone through breakups where I've wondered, like, wait, did I like that show or did we just watch that together? Did I like that style of music or was that something we did? And it's like you got to go through that whole process of rediscovering who you are. And I don't, I know it sounds like a bad thing. It's like, you're losing your authentic self if you go into a relationship because you start merging your identities and your stories with another person. But I don't look at it that way. It's like the relationship can be authentic too. It's just the breakup is hard because it's like you are retreating back to an earlier version of yourself. And that can be a very challenging and painful thing to do.
To this relative value thing and whatever gender differences may exist, Paul, many people have heard that the growing number of women who out-earn or professionally outrank men will have a harder time finding love. What can you tell us about this?
Yes. So I don't link women's increasing earning prospects or educational prospects with anything related to the rise of singles. And that's for a few different reasons. One is that, look, I acknowledge when you ask people on surveys, women will say they care about earning potential more than men. Men might even say they're sometimes intimidated by earning potential, but I cannot emphasize this enough. When we look at what actually inspires either people's attraction to people they're first meeting or their long-term interest in somebody, ambition is an aphrodisiac. It's not a huge aphrodisiac, but yeah, we like people more when they seem ambitious. And that is just as true for men as it is for women. So across the board, ambition is a good thing. We don't see evidence that either gender is punished on average for being too ambitious. Second, um, these days, women do earn more higher ed degrees than men do, at least in many countries, in the United States, certainly. Um, are we seeing now that these women are less likely to form relationships or get married? No, there's no evidence of that whatsoever. In fact, when pairs form these days, what you see is that, yeah, if there's an educational level mismatch, the woman is going to be more educated than the man. And so women are indeed, quote unquote, marrying down. And are these relationships more troubled in some way? Absolutely not. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. These relationships seem just as likely to succeed as what we saw in ages past, et cetera, et cetera. So none of this is deeply concerning to me. What I do worry about is if men, maybe especially men at a lower level of SES, if they are not out in society, if they are the ones who are being hit hard by the friendship recession, if they are the ones who are spending more time at home on screens and not going out, then they are not going to meet women, period. And that will lead to a singlehood recession for them. They won't be out there meeting folks. You've got now a gender imbalance out there. This is something that I worry about.
I'll note that you don't actually think this is accurate, but will you explain what the zero-sum model is for the way human mating is supposed to work?
Yeah, the zero sum model, it goes back to this idea that you're either like good at long-term relationships or you're good at short-term relationships. And that, a factor that makes you good at one thing is going to make you bad at the other thing. And I think the classic example that people think of it might be something like physical attractiveness. Like people who are physically attractive, they get an edge in the short-term realm, but they're worse long-term partners. I guess maybe because people hit on them more. But anyway, but the thing is the reason these models don't work is because yeah, indeed. Physically attractive people, they probably are more likely to have, more sex partners, more dating partners over the course of their lives. They get more at bats. I mean, that's how I like to think about it. But there's no evidence whatsoever that their long-term relationships are any better or worse than people who are not physically attractive. It's just unrelated. This gets to a broader issue that we see, which is that it's very easy to kind of use traits to figure out who's initially desirable, but it gets much harder to do that if we're trying to predict whether relationships are likely to last or be long term. And that goes back to what I was talking about earlier. A relationship is mostly what two people are constructing together rather than like, oh, the traits that you brought with you into the relationship. Not that those don't matter at all, but they matter a lot less than what two people construct together.
Is there anything about following the apparent lessons of the Evo script with something like the rules that actually might make it less likely that we find a partner with whom we can find long-term satisfaction?
Yeah, I mean, I think the rules is an amazing example. I mean, yeah, I mean, if folks don't know, I kind of hope they don't. But anyway, the rules. The book came out of the '90s. It's basically like sort of like traditional advice mainly directed at women for how to like keep a man on the hook, but also like had some lay evolutionary ideas thrown in there. But the core thesis is basically like be guarded, resist, and never really be vulnerable or open up. And that's the way to land a man. And of all the messages I've ever seen out there, I've never seen one that conflicts more directly with everything we know in the science, which is that basically vulnerability, like part of what it means to be in a close relationship is to be vulnerable, to be open about your anxieties and your fears. And I recognize that's scary for a lot of people and really does open people up to getting hurt. But the happiest, most satisfying, long lasting, close relationships are indeed the relationships where people are able to do that. And often where they're willing to be a little bit vulnerable with each other, even from some of the opening moments. I mean, maybe not minute 3, but, maybe minute 30.
So if we're really attracted to someone, but we feel like we always have to be on our best behavior to keep them interested, that's a red flag?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good way of putting it. It's a red flag. It's a kind of red flag where you can do some deep personal interrogation. Why do I feel like I am still guarded around this person? Like I can't really be myself. And I don't know the answer in the abstract because it could be that there is something about this person that makes you feel smaller, that makes you feel like you can't be the kind of person that you want to be. And that's not great. Maybe this is not the relationship for you. But it's also possible that this is your lens, right? That these are your assumptions about what would happen if you opened up to somebody else. I mean, this is a tension that we talk about in relationships research all the time. Like, yep, sometimes things are going on in your head. It's, your filters and your assumptions that you need to interrogate. But sometimes it's something that's dyadic and that's going on between the two of you. And it can be tricky to like figure out which is which. But yeah, if you're feeling like you don't really want to open up, and that's a dyadic thing, and that probably says something about the dyad rather than, just being about you.
Speaking of anyone's own assumptions, when you say most people don't actually have a type that will make them happy as a partner, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I mean, this is fascinating. We started originally looking at this idea like, oh, what do men and women want? What do they want in the abstract? Okay, what do they want when they meet somebody face to face? And then we moved on to this question of, well, let's not worry about people's gender for a second. Let's just figure out, well, okay, you say you're looking for somebody who is, I don't know, adventurous and exciting. So if I introduce you to the adventurous and exciting partners, do you gravitate toward them more than somebody who didn't have that preference? And what we found over and over again was that, boy, what people were saying appeals to them when they think about traits in the abstract. It just didn't match up all that great with what ended up appealing to them in the moment once they met people face to face. Sometimes I use this like restaurant ordering metaphor in case this is helpful, but imagine sitting down to order at a restaurant and you order something off the menu and your seatmate orders something off the menu. And typically, if the waiter had switched up who got which dish, you'd be upset or you'd trade with your friend. You'd say, "Hey, that was what I ordered." But when we look at attraction, it's like the waiter arrives with the dishes switched and you don't even notice. In other words, what you ordered was going to appeal to you just the same as what your buddy ordered.
So, Paul, if we don't necessarily know what we want in the moment, but we can find ourselves attracted to someone by surprise, are we just bad at writing down the list of qualities we hope for in our someday partner?
Yeah, it's an interesting thought experiment. Like what if we could, help people to interrogate their own assumptions a little bit more? It's possible that, and for all I know, it is entirely within the realm of possibility that this is what some of the best matchmakers do, whether it's a good friend or a professional, is they get people to interrogate their assumptions about what it is they're looking for and what really matters to them. This is all possible. I will say, in addition, I very much come at this perspective from a place of people kind of don't know what they want until they are out there and they feel it and they experience it with a given person. And that a person who genuinely looks like they would have been terrible for us on paper ends up really appealing to us once we're spending time with that person. So, just to bring it back to online dating, but also just our modern ideas about how we treat dating like it's shopping and like we can draw up the perfect person. I think the real problem here is that it puts us in a mindset where, yeah, we think we can construct what it is we're looking for, and we spend more time swiping than we do just like hanging out with people and experiencing people. And, if anything, that's the thing that I lament the most is that, if we just spend time in the presence of other people, give people a chance to surprise us, give somebody a chance to knock us off our feet that never would have appealed to us on paper. I want to see us doing more of that. I think there really was a lot of good in those kinds of approaches.
I hear you loud and clear that in an ideal world, we would be meeting potential partners sort of out in the wild, interacting with them, getting to know them first before we even decide to date them. But the truth is, as you know, a lot of dating starts online now. So what advice do you have for people who find potential partners using apps?
Yeah, so if you're using the apps, and I'm not saying everybody's got to ditch the apps. I understand the apps have done a lot of good. I mean, odds are 30 to 40% of the people listening, if they're in a relationship, that relationship was formed through the apps. That is wonderful. If the apps, one thing that I would advise is the apps followed by quick live impression is not the best because, again, only certain people are going to be able to blow you away after 20 minutes. Yes, you'll get a little bit of a sense of whether there's compatibility there if you're meeting somebody for 20 minutes, but that 20-minute sense is about the least stable impression that you're going to get of another person. I'd like to advocate that people, go on 3 dates. If they're willing to give somebody one, maybe give them 3, even if that first date is just a little middling, because a second impression is a lot more stable than a first impression, and a third impression is even more stable than that. And so if you really want to know if there's a sense of compatibility there, I'd at least recommend giving people 3 chances if you're using the apps.
What if they're horrible on that first date?
Yeah, I mean, this is tricky because some dates are so truly awful that that um it feels irresponsible for me to suggest like, yeah, just give him another chance. Like, so what if he was like incredibly rude to the waiter and like, I don't know, threw his plate on the ground or something? I mean, I'm sure a lot of people have far worse first date stories than that. I just want to note for the record that when people have formed relationships classically, and you trace the origin of their relationships all the way back to the beginning. So these all were successful relationships. And you ask them, how did you feel about this person when you first met? There is a hefty proportion of these folks, it's really like a third at least, who are like, I really did not like you very much at all when we first met. And so I don't know what to say. Like, a lot of times our first impressions of somebody else are not that great, and we grow to like them a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more as we spend time with them. I get it. People's time is limited. When you're already in, the way I think these relationships happen is that these people had to keep spending time together. It wasn't like I'll give him 10 dates. Like, I'm not advocating for that. But I just feel compelled to point out that first impressions can be pretty unstable, even if we're looking at what will, something that will eventually go on to be a successful relationship.
Paul Eastwick is professor of psychology at UC Davis and author of Bonded by Evolution, The New Science of Love and Connection. Paul, thanks so much for the conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on.
Think is distributed by PRX, the Public Radio Exchange. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, anywhere you get podcasts, or at think.kera.org. Again, I'm Chris Boyd. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.
From PRX.